You may have spent years thinking you're not that intelligent, maybe because you don't look like what people expect intelligence to look like. You don't always have the fastest answer. You question yourself. You overthink. You notice things other people ignore. And sometimes, you probably mistake those things for weaknesses. But what if some of the things you've always criticized about yourself are actually signs of a mind that works differently? Today, we're going to look at 7 of them. And the last, one might explain why intelligent people often don't realize they're intelligent. 1. You question your own thinking. You have probably done this before. You finish a conversation, walk away, and then replay it in your head. You think about what you said, what the other person meant, what you might have misunderstood. And eventually, you wonder, was I wrong? At first, this can feel like insecurity, but there is an important difference between insecurity and intellectual self-awareness. Insecurity says, I'm probably wrong because I'm not good enough. Intellectual humility says, I could be wrong because I don't have all the information. That difference matters. A flexible mind doesn't only ask, what do I believe? It also asks, why do I believe it? What evidence supports it? What would make me change my mind? This ability to examine your own thinking is called metacognition, and it can make you less certain, not more. That's because the more seriously you examine an idea, the more possibilities you begin to see. You realize that situations are rarely as simple as they first appear. You realize that your first impression isn't always correct, and you become comfortable saying, maybe there's something I'm missing. So, if you often question your own conclusions, don't automatically assume you're confused. You may simply be more aware of the limits of your own knowledge. Sometimes, intelligence doesn't give you more certainty. It gives you better questions. 2. You notice patterns. Other people miss you. You may notice things without even trying. Someone's tone changes slightly, and you immediately sense that something is different. A problem happens today, and you remember that something very similar happened months ago. You notice that certain people repeat the same behavior in completely different situations. Other people see separate events. You see a connection. This is one of the most interesting things about intelligent thinking. It's not only about remembering information, it's about connecting information. One conversation reminds you of another. One behavior reveals a larger pattern. One small detail changes the way you understand everything around it. And sometimes you can't even explain how you noticed. You just did. But there is an important distinction. Seeing patterns doesn't mean every pattern you see is real. The human brain is extremely good at finding connections, even when those connections are coincidental. So stronger thinking requires a second step. Don't just ask, did I notice a pattern? Ask, is this pattern actually supported by evidence? That is where observation becomes critical thinking. If you constantly notice small inconsistencies, repeated behaviors, or connections other people overlook, you may simply have a strong tendency toward pattern recognition. And once you learn to combine that ability with skepticism, it becomes even more useful. You don't just notice, you investigate. 3. You are curious about things that seem useless to everyone else. You search for one simple answer. Then you find another question. That question leads to another. And suddenly, an hour has passed. Maybe you're researching psychology, maybe history, maybe technology, maybe some completely random subject you discovered 5 minutes ago. Nobody asked you to learn it. There is no reward. You simply want to understand. That's the important part. Curiosity isn't always about usefulness. Sometimes you want to know something simply because not knowing bothers you. You don't stop at, what happened? You ask, why did it happen? Then, why? Does it work that way? And eventually, what would happen if it were different? This is why curious people can sometimes look distracted. Their attention is constantly being pulled toward unanswered questions. And there is an interesting paradox here. The more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. So you may actually feel less intelligent as your knowledge grows. You discover more complexity, more exceptions, more unanswered questions. But that feeling isn't necessarily evidence that you're unintelligent. It can mean that your understanding has become more sophisticated. A shallow understanding makes a subject look simple. A deeper understanding reveals how complicated it really is. So if you're the person who always asks, "But why?" don't lose that part of yourself. Your curiosity may be one of the strongest things driving your ability to learn. 4. You can say, "I don't know." This sounds simple, but many people struggle with it. Someone asks you a question. You could guess. You could pretend you know. You could give a confident answer and hope nobody challenges you, or you could simply say, "I don't know." For some people, admitting ignorance feels like losing status, but intellectually mature people understand something important. Pretending to know doesn't make you smarter. It only makes your ignorance harder to correct. When you say, "I don't know," you create space for learning. You can investigate, you can listen, you can change your mind, you can discover that your original assumption was wrong, and that's something many people avoid. They would rather defend an incorrect opinion than admit they don't have enough information, because their goal isn't always to understand. Sometimes, their goal is simply to look right. But intelligence doesn't need to look impressive all the time. It needs to remain open. A person who says, "I don't know yet," has something the person who pretends to know doesn't have. Room to improve. So if you're comfortable admitting that you don't have an answer, don't mistake that for weakness. Knowing what you don't know is part of knowing anything at all. 5. You can understand people you disagree with. You don't have to agree with someone to understand them. You may hear an opinion that completely contradicts your own and still think, "I understand why they see it that way." That requires mental flexibility. You have to temporarily step outside your own perspective. You ask, what information are they seeing that I'm not? What experiences shape their opinion? What would this look like if I were in their position? And then you can return to your own conclusion. Understanding another perspective doesn't mean accepting it. It means you're capable of examining an idea before rejecting it. That's important because intelligent thinking isn't just about defending your current beliefs. It's about being able to update them. If new information appears, you can change your position. If someone makes a better argument, you can admit it. If you discover that your assumption was wrong, you can move forward. You don't need to treat changing your mind as humiliation. You treat it as learning, and that is a very different mindset. People who need to be right at all costs eventually become prisoners of their own opinions. But if you're willing to say, "I never thought about it that way," you leave yourself open to something most people miss: the possibility that you can be wrong without becoming less valuable. 6. You actually enjoy being alone. There is a difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is wanting connection and not having it. Solitude is being comfortable with your own company. Maybe you enjoy walking alone, driving alone, eating alone, working without constant conversation, sitting somewhere quietly with your thoughts. That doesn't necessarily mean you dislike people. You may simply not need constant stimulation, and when the noise disappears, something interesting can happen. You start thinking, you connect ideas, you reflect on conversations, you solve problems, you imagine possibilities, you process experiences that you never had time to process while surrounded by other people. Of course, enjoying solitude doesn't automatically mean you're intelligent, but if being alone gives your mind space to explore, create, reflect, and learn, then solitude may be an important part of how you function. Some people recharge through stimulation, others recharge through silence. And if you've always felt strangely comfortable in your own company, you don't necessarily need to become more social just to fit someone else's definition of normal. Maybe your mind simply works better when it has room to breathe. 7. You don't always feel intelligent. This may be the most unexpected sign. You don't walk around thinking you're smarter than everyone else. You may actually spend a lot of time thinking about everything you don't know. You see someone who is incredibly good at something and think, I could never do that. You remember your mistakes, your weaknesses, the subjects you don't understand, the people who know more than you, and because you're aware of your limitations, you underestimate yourself. But here's the strange thing about learning. The more deeply you understand something, the more clearly you can see how much remains unknown. A beginner may look at a complicated subject and think, that's simple. Someone who has studied it for years sees exceptions, variables, contradictions, and unanswered questions. The subject becomes bigger, not smaller. That's why intelligence doesn't always feel like certainty. Sometimes it feels like curiosity. Sometimes it feels like doubt. Sometimes it feels like realizing how much more there is to learn. So if you've spent years wondering, am I actually intelligent? Maybe you're measuring intelligence the wrong way. You're expecting it to feel like confidence, like having every answer, like never making mistakes. But intelligence can also look like recognizing the limits of your own knowledge. And once you understand that, you stop needing to prove how smart you are. You become more interested in understanding. The real sign of intelligence. So let's go back. You question your own thinking. You notice patterns. You're deeply curious. You can admit when you don't know. You can understand perspectives different from your own. You enjoy solitude, and you don't always recognize your own intelligence. None of these things prove that someone has a high IQ, and none of them make you automatically better than anyone else. That's not the point. The point is that intelligence isn't always visible from the outside. Sometimes it exists in the way you process information, the way you question, the way you observe, the way you learn, the way you change your mind, and the way you recognize that your first answer isn't necessarily the right one. Maybe that's why you never thought of yourself as particularly intelligent. Because you've been looking for intelligence in the wrong places. You've been looking for confidence, for perfect answers, for extraordinary achievements. But perhaps your intelligence is quieter. Maybe it's the reason you notice the detail everyone else ignores. Maybe it's why one simple question can keep you thinking for hours. Maybe it's why you can't accept an explanation until you understand the reason behind it. Or maybe it's why you are constantly aware of how much you still have to learn. So if several of these signs felt strangely familiar, don't use them as proof that you're smarter than everyone else. Use them as a reason to pay closer attention to your own mind. Because the most interesting thing about intelligence isn't being able to say, I'm smarter than you. It's being able to ask, what is my mind capable of that I've never stopped to notice? And sometimes, the answer is already there. You've just been too used to it to recognize it.